my dears, so glad to have you. I hope that you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about memory loss and all of the messy media tropes that tend to come along with it. I haven't really talked about memory loss on my channel for a while, and I enjoyed diving into the topic again and getting to research it again, so yeah. But before we get into that, I gotta do my little intro of who I am and why I am qualified to be talking about this. So, hi there, hello, my name is Sydney, my pronouns are they, them. I'm an openly queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, and disability advocate. I'm currently working on a thesis about disability, media, education, theater, performance, accessible education, psychology. I think that's all those things. Anything else that fits within any of those categories, basically. And it's culminating in the world's first all-neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which will open this spring. I'm really excited about it. If you want to know more about any and all of those things, it's all linked in the description for you. I'm not going to go into it in depth here because we've done it before. So yeah, I also do twice weekly reviews on all the social medias of Disability, Autistic, and Amnesic Media Rep. I will link playlists of those in the description for you if you want to binge watch them as well. But what people don't realize is that in general, I only watch documentary movies, TV shows. I don't like watching fiction. So the only fiction I consume at this point is disability representation, and let me tell you, it's weird. My view of media in the world is very strange. Oh, also I'm a white person in their early 20s with shoulder length, light brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a light yellow top with orange flowers on it, and it has puffed sleeves, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. You are welcome to like, comment, subscribe, leave a super thanks, whatever brings you joy, but also no pressure. And as a general map for today, we're gonna talk about what my camera just flipped orientations. Whoa, that was weird. We're gonna talk about what my memory loss is, or at least what we think it might be. Nobody's really sure. And then the tropes that we most often see in the media and their impact on the wider world of people with memory loss, and how, I don't know, maybe we should try to consume media, and in general look at the world more critically, because critical thinking we need to do more of that. So step one, what kind of memory loss do I have and how does it work? That's a more complicated question than one would think. The SparkNotes version, also content warning, I guess, I was in an abusive relationship. Said person kind of coerced me to take more medication for my disability than I really should have. And also, I went on a new medication because of them that was supposed to help said disability. But the thing about the new medication is that due to like all of my comorbidities, it was really unsafe for me to go on that medication. But somehow all 7 of my doctors missed that and also told me, hey Sydney, don't read the side effects. You don't need to know those, you're gonna get too anxious about it. And I was like, okay. And they kept being like, oh, it doesn't seem to be working, you should probably increase your dose. So I kept increasing my dose, and then over the span of like 2.5 months, my body slowly fell apart and I lost the ability to digest food, and I had constant migraines and I couldn't walk and I passed out a lot, you know, all good things. And then everybody realized what was going on when the pandemic started. I was immediately pulled off the medication and I went into a sort of, well, the best version of rehab that you can go into given the fact that pandemic. And during this rehab time, I met with many different doctors trying to figure out what specifically had happened to my brain. And there are various theories, none of which can actually really ever be tested because whatever actual brain damage I have would be pretty minuscule on like a brain scan. And since there's no such thing as a normal brain, that makes comparisons between brains very difficult. And I don't have any scans from earlier in my life, so we wouldn't really be able to figure out what damage I actually have, or what the extent of that damage is, if that makes sense. Had I done a brain scan earlier in my life, we probably would have had that information. Or if it were like a bigger brain injury, like a traumatic brain injury, that would also make it clear. But yeah, we're just existing solely in the world of theory, and that's fine. So the first hypothesis is that since my really severe migraines tend to look like strokes, that's good. And during this period of my life, I had the worst migraines that I've ever had in my life, and medication wasn't helping them when I was having them. We can kind of pinpoint 3 specific times, looking back, that those migraines might have actually just been tiny strokes. So that's good. Another hypothesis is that the medication I was on somehow permanently messed with the chemistry of my brain. There's also the fact that I was frequently passing out and couldn't digest food, so it's likely that the nutrients put my brain, or lack of nutrients put my brain into some sort of survival mode state, and it stopped certain functions in order to conserve energy, and it was for a long enough period of time that those neuronal connections may have started to atrophy. The psychological trauma hypothesis is that this is a form of dissociative amnesia caused by how horrible those like 6-ish months of my life were, so my brain stopped focusing, just kind of completely dissociated and spaced out, stopped doing the memory thing. And then also the fact that during my rehab period, I connected a lot more with the neurodivergent community and was starting to understand how my autistic brain works naturally. So a lot of these things probably existed the whole time, but now I have names for them, so I'm recognizing them more. And I think that like looking at all of this stuff and looking at all of the evidence and whatnot, I think I can fairly honestly say that it was probably a mix of all of these factors. But either way, all that I really need to know, all that really matters to me is a trauma happened, my brain went, oh dear, and now it's changed forever and I have memory loss. And my official diagnosis is technically dissociative amnesia. We talked about that a lot in my autism and trauma video, which you can watch up here, but there's also the acknowledgement that in conjunction with the dissociative amnesia, there's probably some sort of bio-neurological cause in combination with the psychological cause, but there's not really a major way to diagnose it because we can't test for it, if that makes sense. And also, again, I don't really care. All I know is my brain is different, my memory is wonky, and I know how to handle it now, so I'm good. But I will say that my, whatever I figured it out, who really cares mindset is a fairly recent one, and it did not feel that way for a very long time afterward. I just kind of reached a point where I figured out ways to manually fill the holes and accommodate my needs, and they've become such habit that it feels like my memory is no different from what it used to be. Or maybe I just forgot when it was different. That's also fairly likely. But anyway, basically, my brain functions like a very small colander. Everything comes in, and a lot of it just goes right back out. And my brain, its filing system of all the files of memories from my earlier life, the cabinets all kind of exploded and there's just piles all over the floor. So like all the memories are in there, but I can't find any of them. I'm always shuffling through and sometimes things appear, and my brain kind of goes through it like a child who's cleaning their room and constantly finding new things to play with that distract them for a while from the original task, and they don't remember what the original task was, nor why this random fun thing appeared. But instead of fun toys to play with that you found in your room that you thought you'd lost, it's just traumatic events. So there's that. I've been journaling for like 4 years straight, and I've made some manual timelines of various things in my life, so if I have a weird flashback, I can try to see where it fits into the story that I put together with pictures and notes and whatnot. So basically, instead of information following the typical path of like information outside brain into short-term memory inside brain into storage in long-term memory inside brain, for me, information is outside, it goes into my head, it goes to the short-term memory, I manually record it in a journal or with a camera or a random sticky note, and then sometimes that information decides to go into storage in my long-term memory, and sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, I have an external version to look back on if I need it. And the system works really well. Except when it doesn't. It's fine. We're also going to talk about this later in the video, but the brain is a whole lot more plastic than people think it is. It is ever-changing, and since post-brain damage, I became an educational YouTuber, and I have to write 2 research papers a week for it, effectively. I usually do several videos a week. But anyway, my memory for factual information and research and ability to focus on new things has greatly improved over time. In fact, probably better. It's probably better than it used to be before damage. So while I often forget things, like very random things, and I am truly incapable of taking exams or tests that don't allow notes because I can't just cram information into my brain, I can memorize scripts very easily. But either way, I can pretty much function pretty normally, more or less, in the rest of my life. So in regards to how my memory connects to memory loss media representation, a lot of media memory loss is portrayed as like bad head bonk made complete amnesia. I do not have experience with the blunt trauma brain damage or like full-on sections of the brain being destroyed brain damage. Mine was very much more on the micro level in probably several different places, but we're not positive. And it's just as equally valid as brain damage and as memory loss, but I'm not going to claim to have the same lived experience as somebody with a more traditional, I don't like that word, but traditional traumatic brain injury. And, you know, somebody with a TBI affecting their memory may have completely different opinions on the accuracy of these tropes. Obviously, I did a ton of research on these topics, and I am a psychology major and I've taken several memory classes, so on some level their experiences and that accuracy is going to be represented here, but I did just want to put that out there. Now, what I find the most interesting about memory loss media representation is that the characters and the plotline and the films feel much like flimsier, or at least more one-dimensional than I typically experience with my autistic or disabled representation that I view. And I would assume that's generally because when people come up with the idea for a memory loss plot, they often forget that memory loss is a real thing that real people experience, and that there's nuance to how you should go about creating it. Like, typically with intellectual or developmental disability or physical disability, people will often think a bit harder about that before they go into it sometimes. It happens way more than it usually does with memory loss, because most of the time when they're doing like an amnesia situation with a 25-year-old, they don't think that that's possible, which is not true. So the first trope, and the one that we see most often, is the existence of memory loss as metaphor. This is not surprising. It's what is most common in regular disability representation as well. But it exists as a way to remind the audience to be grateful for what they have, or remind them that they always have the chance to change as a human being, because this person was able to change themselves after, a forced clean slate. We see memory loss as a metaphor for going down the wrong path and forgetting who you are, a metaphor for emptiness and vulnerability and an empty, shell of a human being. Also, as a really bad soap opera twist to add some drama points, but we're gonna ignore that. General idea here is that characters lose their memory to create some sort of tension or emotional response in the media and for the consumers of said media, with the story being about how everybody around this person copes with the fact that this person is now completely empty and vulnerable, and oh, how horrible it is for them to have to watch all this happen to this poor person, and not, on the person who just lost their memory. Everybody in every direction is making noise right now, and So the fact that memory loss is very, very rarely losing everything in general. Memory loss is not a clean slate of, oh, everything's gone. It's a super jagged and random, and some things stay and some things don't, and everything's disconnected. And the person experiencing the memory loss is usually at least aware that something isn't quite right if they're not aware that their memory is sketchy directly. People with memory loss still have personalities. We still exist as human beings. We still have wants and needs. And there is a very real struggle to accept that your memory is altered forever and figuring out how to move forward from that point. But also, most people that I know with memory loss are very nonchalant about the whole thing at this point. It's just, it is, and we've adapted, and we are continuing to exist. In the same way that somebody who's in a wheelchair doesn't spend, typically, their whole life being like, oh, I'm so sad I'm in a wheelchair. It's like, okay, this is life now, and I'm moving on, and it exists. But then in things that do acknowledge that, no, memory is not a clean slate, and memory loss is in fact jagged and random, their understanding of that exists only as long as it's convenient to the plot. Suddenly they'll randomly remember random things at the perfect moment that the information needs to be remembered. And this obviously does have a little bit of nuance, right? I know that in particular situations where I'm supposed to remember a specific thing, sometimes that situation will trigger a flashback to that specific thing that I'm supposed to remember, and I do remember it, but that is very 50-50, if not 25-75. And in films or TV shows, it's always only when they need it, and it's super hyper convenient for the plot, and it feels very fake, which makes sense because, well, it is. There's also the trope of, oh, I found this one object, or this one person, and it made everything come flooding back, and that is also no. It is common for flashbacks to snowball in the sense that you start to focus on reconstructing a narrative, and when that happens, you're gonna find more key pieces of information, and it's gonna flood back a little more rapidly than it would just randomly, kind of in the sense that in Anastasia, she sees the music box and she hears the song, and it reminds her that, oh, she was once in the palace. But she doesn't hear that and immediately go, oh, I must be the lost princess, and here's what happened to me. She has to still continue to put all of the pieces slowly and painfully together and trying to figure out what the foggy mess of memory could potentially be, and she never ends up getting everything back. So basically, flashbacks are real and they can be caused by things and people and places, but they don't work like you usually see them working, and all of your memory is not going to come back in one go, because that's not how the brain works. One of the texts that I read specifically about memory loss representation specifically spoke about how a large swath of media is about adult kids being caregivers for their old female relative, usually their mother or grandmother, with some form of memory loss, and how this contributes to a dehumanizing portrayal of memory loss as something that only old people experience, and amnesics as fundamentally childlike and odd and different and can't live happy lives. Also a burden. The burden narrative is always there. And obviously there's this whole metaphorical tie-in of oh, the breaking down of a mother-child relationship as roles are reversed, and we're seeing disability solely in the domestic space because it can't exist outside in the real world. And I thoroughly agree with this. I will also say that as somebody who's kept a list of all the representation that I found, the majority is in fact not about elderly people. But that being said, people may not look at that as memory loss representation. So when I look up memory loss representation, it doesn't come up on lists and reviews and whatnot. So I've not found it to be very common, but it could be very, very common. I truly have no idea. Now, the most common plot point that I've seen is for memory loss films to be very shooty stabby. We're gonna put it that way. It's nearly always a woman, and she gets caught up in some sort of criminal behavior, and then the bad guy tries to take her out, and she ends up forgetting everything and trying to start over with a new life, except the bad guy's still after her, or some version of that. And look, I would love it if I had a cool secret spy life that I've forgotten about. That would be incredibly wonderful. But the whole premise is way too weird and way too unlikely to have this many films with that premise. Because again, clean slate memory loss does not really exist. And also, this perpetuates a narrative of, oh, the disability is your fault because you were doing illegal things. Which obviously I don't like that. Another common plot thing we see is the personality change. They were a really bad person, they got a nice big old bonk on the head, and now they're an amazing human being. For example, Regarding Henry is a great example of this, and they did such a good job that it almost feels like they're advertising brain damage. Oh, that movie was a mess. I've seen it twice now, and I don't quite know why, but it's bad. Highly recommend it. Anyway, so again, this is kind of nuanced, right? Some frontal lobe damage can impact your personality, so post-brain damage, you will potentially change personalities, though in the most famous case of frontal lobe damage, like my man Phineas Gage, you'll become much angrier and impulsive as a human being rather than a nicer one, but also other forms of brain damage can change your personality in different ways, especially neurodegenerative conditions such as dementia and Alzheimer's, but it's not very common, and accuracy, no. I should also mention that in the media, the most common cause of memory loss is some sort of glorified head bonk. That is actually the least common form of memory loss. You are way more likely to get your brain damage from stroke, brain infection, or neurosurgery, or emotional trauma than any direct brain injury from some sort of head bonk. And also the trope of, oh, they had a second head bonk and now the brain is suddenly righted itself is most obviously wildly incorrect. Please no. Let's not head bonk, because head bonk bad. And also kind of inaccurate in media, but mostly the bad thing. Wear your helmets. I don't know where I'm going with this. Now, while we're talking about accuracy, in reality, amnesic patients experience significant difficulties in taking in new information, making many everyday tasks extremely difficult. The idea that somebody can just lose their entire past memory and then continue to function completely normally otherwise is entirely absurd. First of all, the ability to create new memories and the ability to retain old ones are obviously interrelated systems on some level, so damage to one thing gonna cause damage to the other thing. They very much come hand in hand. And also, you would be surprised the sort of weird things that you struggle with after memory loss. Like, holding down jobs is very difficult because you forget that you have a job, or you forget what tasks you need to do, or you may need to be taught the same basic skill 15 different times because every single time you're taught it, you forget how to do it again. Holding down relationships is really difficult because you forget that people exist. Luckily, my friends are cool with that, but I still forget that people exist very regularly. Holding conversations is difficult. I also had a bunch of new allergies after my brain damage because I also had like internal damage, and I kept forgetting I had allergies, and so I would just eat things I was allergic to and then somehow be surprised when I would get really sick. And this kind of stuff takes years to find a system on how to function if the person ends up finding a system at all. So the whole, yeah, they lost their memory, but now they're right back to their old life. They just forgot what they used to do before then. Representation is not accurate, because if you forgot, if your memory loss is bad enough to forget everything, you're not really going to be able to immediately start functioning completely normally. And most importantly, there are kinds of two categories of memory loss. There's those with a neurological basis and those with psychiatric basis. And they behave very differently because obviously the brain looks different depending on the kind of brain issue. And I'm very blessed to be probably a combination of both of those things. That's pretty rare, but I'm cool, I guess. What I'm trying to say is that movies pick and choose what symptoms and what experiences they want to use for their own plot desires, and they don't think about accuracy at all. The most commonly agreed features of organic amnesic syndromes include normal intelligence and attention span with severe and permanent difficulties in taking in new information. Personality and identity are unaffected. These distinctions, which in a medical setting are critical in terms of prognosis and treatment, are often blurred at the movies. Memory loss isn't as scandalous or beautifully tragic and whatever else you want to call it as people are seemingly convinced it is by the media. You usually cannot tell that somebody has memory loss. You also often don't know that they have memory loss, and it's kind of just a thing that happens. But based on what we see in TV and books and movies, people think that if these narratives are this common and this similar to each other, they're all probably at least somewhat accurate. And so they think that if you just think harder, you will remember something, because that's how various characters suddenly remember for the sake of the plot. They think that, oh, memory loss is a death sentence and the worst possible thing that could ever happen to a person because it makes you completely empty inside and completely vulnerable and you lose absolutely everything. And that's just not true. I once had a memory professor specifically show us a quote about how a human without memory is not human at all. And frankly, I'm still mad about it. But anyway, people also think that once your memory is destroyed, and obviously when it's destroyed, it's just a completely clean slate, because that's how that works, you can never get it back, or that you get all of it back immediately and it's exactly the same when you get it back, when in reality you usually get some bits and pieces back over time and try to construct some sort of cohesive narrative. And many people can retrain their memory to function quite well if they don't have lots of direct damage to the systems themselves, or at least it appears that way because they learn how to cope with it and make accommodations for themselves and fill in those gaps manually. So next time you hear about somebody saying that memory loss is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to a person, maybe call them out on that, because frankly, anybody can handle anything once it happens to them, so I think that if that did happen to you, you'd probably figure it out. And also, that's kind of like saying, oh gosh, if I were disabled, I definitely would kill myself, which really shows how you feel about disabled bodies and disabled people. Particularly that you don't see us as people who are capable of living perfectly long, happy, and healthy lives, or as healthy as we can be, and are also currently doing so, because human nature is adaptation and figuring out how to try new things and how to deal with the situations that are given to you. And that's also how regular nature works. Not just humans, we're all about survival. My tone for this video is truly wacky. Anyway, let me know what tropes bother you the most in the comments. Also, if you have any memory loss media to recommend, that is my shortest list in comparison to my disability and autism rep, so I haven't reviewed it in a while because I don't have much, so I would absolutely love your input on that. And reminder to think critically about the media that you consume. Think about how it's making you see other people, and if you want to be seeing other people in that light, because despite what one of my professors did say, disabled people are still in fact people who deserve to be treated as people. That simple. As always, thanks for listening. Thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.